Hello, hello, and welcome to UMedia Chicago's Speak On It, a series of author talks virtually connecting teams to successful writers for conversations about books, writing, creativity, and more. I am Alex, your friendly neighborhood teen librarian, and I'm so excited to welcome our guest today. Jenny Lee is a television writer and producer who has worked on many amazing shows. She's the author of essay collections and 2 middle grade novels, and Anna Kay, A Love Story, is her debut YA novel, which we're very excited about. So pretty. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and her Newfoundland Gemma, which is a very large dog.
Yes.
Very, very large dog. Thank you so much for joining us, Jenny. We really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me, Alex. I'm excited to be here.
Hey, so for those who are watching live, we want your questions too. So feel free to put them in the chat and we will ask as many as possible. All right. So Jenny, let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
When did you start writing?
I think I've been writing, I feel like since I was like a little girl. I've always loved reading. I've been a huge reader. I have many very important libraries and librarians in my history, in my past. And I remember, I don't know if they actually teach cursive writing as much anymore in schools, but I remember that little paper when we learned and it had the dotted line in the middle. And I remember my first story was about a little black kitten, I think named Blackie, that lived in a jack-o'-lantern. I remember writing that. And then I remember my mom put it up on the fridge. So that was like my first like real story I was super proud of. So.
Oh, that's adorable. I love that. What were some of your favorite authors or like books when you were young?
I went through a big Stephen King phase of like the early Stephen King. And I remember, I think the story, I don't know if it was 4th or 5th grade, I had to write a story and I wrote about like a scavenger hunt where basically everyone started dying. I mean, as they were doing the scavenger hunt. Like, this is a little dark for this age, but I was reading a lot of Stephen King. I distinctly remember reading Pet Sematary in my room, so scared. And I went downstairs to like, had to be near like my parents, like, and read there because I was too freaked out in my room.
I feel like that's a common theme. Like several authors have been like, I read Stephen King when I was way too young to be reading Stephen King. He's such an influential writer. And I'm a scaredy cat, so I never read Stephen King.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I mean, I read like R.L. Stein, but I didn't read Stephen King. Yeah.
I'm still so impressed. It's funny. I'm recently been back into reading some of his books. So I've read some of his more recent, there was a big gap where I just wasn't who can keep up with all of his books. It's incredible. But his book on writing is so amazing that he wrote, and I saw him speak once and just his grasp of characters is just amazing to me. Like I really think he's one of the best for sure.
Did you, so you started writing when you were young. Was that was writing professionally a goal for you through high school and college or?
I think it was a goal for me. It was definitely not a goal for my parents. My parents, I was raised in Tennessee, and my parents were Korean immigrants, and I was born in Nashville. They really were that stereotypical Asian family where like, you are going to go to an Ivy League school and become a lawyer. And like, I was honestly remember being told that basically like a sophomore in high school, but I actually had placed in a couple different writing contests, like in high school, like the Young Tennessee Writers Contests. And then I actually it was second place in like the Scholastic Literary Cavalcade, like magazine contest. And I remember going to my parents and being like, oh my gosh, this is proof. I placed in a national contest. I want to be a writer. This proves it. And my father was like, you placed second. You are not first best. And it's so hard to be a writer and artist that honestly, like you really need to be the best. I don't think you should pursue this.
Oh no.
I know, I really did have that thing. But I think it made me a better writer. I mean, because I had, you got to struggle as an artist, basically. So then at the end, I applied to NYU Tisch School of the Arts because they contacted me from placing in some of these contests. And I applied secretly early, got in and told my parents, I'm like, this is what I want to do. I want to go to this school. And my dad said no. And then I was like, all right, well, I'm not going to go to college then. And it turned into a whole thing. And then, but the nice end of the story is basically they're like, fine, you win, you can go. But I'd never been to New York City. I never got to see the school. So they just like showed up, dropped me off at the dorm and were like, bye-bye. I was like, okay, bye.
Wow. That's some culture shock.
Yeah, it's a big culture shock to go. I mean, the town I was living in at the time was like population 11,000 people. and then to go to New York City. I was terrified that first week, but then I really fell in love with the city, and it all worked out basically. But it was very nerve-wracking because I think that there's, a lot of the students who I met in college were really like, I want to be a writer, and they had very supportive parents, and they were very committed to like a life in the arts, and I just didn't have that, and I wasn't used to speaking at it and being so bold. So I mean, it was definitely like a little bit scary for me, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you start off with a particular writing area in mind? Like, did you want to write novels? Did you want to write television, or how did that kind of shake out?
I really wanted to write, it's funny because obviously dramatic writing is for like TV and stage. And I was really interested in writing plays. I still am. I mean, I would love to that's still on my bucket list, basically, of writing a play. I loved writing short stories and mainly plays. And I was like, oh, I picked the two things that really you can't make a living on. So quickly kind of, after I graduated college, I was living in New York City for my 20s, and I just went into book publishing because I just wanted to be around sort of the thing, thinking that would kind of be a helpful entree in. It honestly kind of played a little bit of a head trip because I think that when you're working in the business and you almost know too much information, it's kind of overwhelming, especially at that age. You're like, oh, if I haven't made it by the time I'm 25, you just put a lot of pressure on yourself. So I remember a time when I was distinctly like, oh, it's affecting, working in publishing is affecting how I look at books, and I love going to bookstores and libraries, etc. So it was changing the way I read. So I remember I was like, I'm going to switch and do marketing for a while until I can make my big break. But I was always writing like on the side. I was that person who would go home and try to write the novel at night.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So then how did the television writing thing happen? Like how does one do that?
It's funny because, at NYU, I was taking television classes, but I was so not interested in writing TV at the time. I really, I think I was very intimidated by all the visual things and like the technical aspects of writing for that. And they were teaching us, and we had to take video classes, and I found it sort of overwhelming. I ended up actually basically switching out of the Tisch dramatic writing program and just ended up with an English major in creative writing, because that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to put like words on the page. How I got into TV was, my first book, which was honestly forever ago, it was a nonfiction comedic essay about my first marriage. Actually, I'm married to someone else now, and it was called I Do, I Did, Now What? And it was about, comedic essays on your first year of marriage. And that got optioned for a TV show. And so I had nothing to do with it at the time, but they did let me like read the script, and it was obviously very exciting for me to hear about it. And they were going to shoot it. It was for UPN network. Do you remember UPN?
Mm-hmm.
Like UPN,
I do.
WB merged to become the CW back in the day. And so it was for UPN, and it was a comedy. And then I was going to fly out to Los Angeles, and I was like I was living in Boston at the time, and I was buying sunscreen at CVS, and I was so excited. And I got a call from like my agent, and they're like, yeah, they pulled the plug. And I'm like, what do you mean? Because they had built the sets. They were really going to start shooting the next day. And I was going to be a bridesmaid in the opening credits. Like I wasn't going to be in it. That was the little wink to it. And they were just like, oh, the head boss looked at the casting tape. He didn't like it. And they just pulled the plug. And it was like kind of crazy and heartbreaking. But the good news about that is that sort of got me interested in television writing again at the time. Because I was like, oh, I want to learn more about it, because they had sent me some of the scripts. And so then I came out to LA, and I was like, I want to learn some more about it, basically. And I took a lot of general meetings and stuff, because I was like, oh, maybe that is what I want to try. And so then I moved out here maybe 10 or 11 years ago, I think 12 years ago, to try and got on a TV show. And, you start out as a baby writer, and, now I've been, I think, on 12 different shows on writing staffs.
So incredible. It's so interesting to me because like writing a novel or, book-based things is generally very solitary, but TV writing is like, you're in a whole room of people, right? So like, how is that experience different?
I think it works better almost for my personality, because I do like a lot of the solitary aspects of writing, but at the same time, I am such a social person. So normally, like, through my 20s when I was struggling, a struggling writer, I always had a day job. I mean, you have to eat, you need to pay rent, etc. So I always was sort of used to juggling like two sides of myself, which is like a day I'm social, you get to hang out with friends, etc. And then, in the evenings when I would be trying to write on my own. So I really like that aspect of TV, which is that it's a group effort. It's sort of, when I worked on the Disney Channel show, Shake It Up, and I was really a baby writer. It was like only the third job that I had ever had. It's like a play. You get to go and you got to watch the rehearsals and then you go back and you rewrite, but it is a group of like 8 to 10 writers around a table and that's your job. So it really isn't, it's just a group effort. So it's like 100 people pretty much to put on a TV show of like a Disney Channel show. I mean, if you look at like Game of Thrones, it's like 400 people. I mean, that's the difference of scale and scope.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. So looking at your lovely YA novel, Anna Kay, I'm so interested because it's obviously based on Anna Karenina, which is a very well-known book that I feel like most people have heard of Anna Karenina, but a lot of people haven't actually read it. Like, full disclosure, I've never actually read Anna Karenina. I know like kind of the basic plot and the quote about unhappy families, but it's not one that you can kind of assume that people read in English class or anything like that. So was there a particular challenge in adapting that then? Like, did you want people for it to be in? Was that something that like you considered at all, or?
It really turned into more, I mean, it kind of happened very organically. I read that book actually when I was in high school, but it was because I got grounded and I was stuck at home for a month. And my older sister was in college at Brown and she'd taken Russian lit. And she actually sent me her copy of Anna Karenina and was like, here, you have plenty of time on your hands. This book, we just finished it. And I was like, 800-page Russian. I think that's the problem why a lot of people haven't read it. It's like 870 pages. It's huge and it is very dense and it is so many characters. But I loved it. I mean, I was fascinated by it and I've now read it like 3 or 4 different times. And I found that I've like taken something different each time because the Anna and Vronsky story in actual Anna Karenina is probably, it's not really even mainly the center story. There was such a huge cast of characters. There's a part where Tolstoy really tells you like what someone's dog is thinking. Like you get the back history, like the servants who work for Levin. I mean, it's really a sprawling masterpiece. I mean, and I found it just like, it was so interesting. And there were really like 3 major couples. So what happened with me though, is that I read it. I love that book. And then in 2012, I saw that adaptation movie with Keira Knightley, that movie. And I saw it in New York City with my mother over Christmas. And I was like, oh, it was so beautiful. It wasn't my favorite adaptation of it, but I was like so interested in the story. And we were really talking about like, it's really a story about first time about being in love, because in the original, Anna Karenina is married and already has a child, but she's married to a much older man. And it was the 1800s in Russian, in Russian society. And basically it's just, she didn't marry for love, basically. So she had never really experienced it. And then when she meets, Vronsky, which is this famous scene on a train, it just, I don't know, it was so romantic because I felt like they both instantly fell in love with each other immediately. And I sort of liked it. It is a little bit like, he gets a little obsessed with her. And I feel like as a teen girl, like it's like kind of like exactly the adoration you sort of want. You want to like not only be obsessed with the guy, but you want him to be obsessed with you too. So I always like that. But right afterwards we were talking, I was like, oh, if you made a modern adaptation of Anna Karenina, I feel like it should probably be high school students, because I feel like a lot of high school students, that's one of their first times, experience in love. So it just it was a kind of an organic thought where I was like, oh, it would be such a fun YA novel. And I had a book agent at the time and I wrote to her and I was like, ooh, what do you think about this? And she responded immediately and was like, that's a great idea. Do it now. And then cut to 5 years later, I tried so many different versions of it to try to get it to work because it is such a sprawling and huge novel. I did have a hard time wrapping my mind on how to, like, the best way to do it. But in 2017, I had a minor surgery where I was laid up in bed for like a week, basically, which is the time when I finally watched Game of Thrones because I hadn't seen it. because I wanted to read the book first. So I was saving it. So I was like, I want to read the books first, but then I never had time to read the book. So, but then I was laid up in bed. So I watched, 77 hours of TV of dragons and was amazed. But it was actually watching that because then afterwards I read the book, and the book is so similar to the TV show, at least book one, like scene by scene with super short chapters. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's the answer. I've been working in TV for 10 years. I should put my TV knowledge to use for Anna Kay, since it's such a dense thing, and structure it almost like as if I was structuring like a TV show and thinking of it as like very short chapters, scene by scene. So, and then as soon as I got the idea, I started writing probably 2 weeks later.
That's so fascinating. I love that. I love that. So like I'm assuming there was a lot of stuff that you had to cut away. Did you find that you just like focused on the one Anna thread? How did you decide kind of what to keep and what to get rid of?
The three main love stories that I follow in Anna Kay, which is Anna and Vronsky, and it's a love triangle. Mm-hmm. She has a boyfriend named Alexander, and then she meets him because her brother cheated on his girlfriend, and that's what brought her into the city. And it was St. Petersburg and Moscow, but in my book, it's Greenwich, Connecticut, and New York City. And then there's another character, which is 11 and Kitty in the original, but for me, it's Dustin and Kitty. And so they're all sort of intertwined. You really do follow three relationships, and they do in the book. I would say Anna Kay, in the first part one of my book, very closely follows the plot. It's the exact same sort of opening, and it follows it. But by part two, I pretty much deviate because the characters pretty much took a life of their own. Like I have there's definitely a lot of Easter eggs to the original throughout, like a horse race, etc. And some of the events were similar, but I kind of started to change the reactions basically based on like the characters that I created. So
interesting. I think it's so interesting. I feel like we see this a lot with Shakespeare adaptations too, where it's like, they often actually make more sense when you place them in a high school with like young people who are making decisions for the first time instead of like grown adults that you would think maybe would know better. That actually in some ways it's a much better setting.
Yeah, for sure. I don't want to do any spoilers, but my ending is very different than the original ending. And I always knew from the beginning, I was like, it's such a sad, Anna Karenina is a tragedy, and it's very sad what happens to Anna after, she makes one very big mistake, but she does, and I really felt like it was important for teens today, especially for girls. You can make mistakes when you're young, and you can recover from them and live your life. And like everybody, trust me, I got grounded at 15. I was borrowing the parents' car when I shouldn't have. You make mistakes, and I have recovered. So I think that's sort of like what I really wanted to make sure. I really gave a lot of the female characters like agency and a voice, that they were allowed to like have, there's a Kitty and Kimmy in my book, basically, she sort of gets, has a bad relationship with a boy, basically. And she just was too young for like what happened. And she got super depressed afterwards. And I wanted to make her, I just feel like as a young girl in modern society, she got angry and she didn't know what to do with her emotions. And I really wanted to give her a chance to go to the guy and just tell him what she thought, like that you wronged me and that it wasn't, and I just want to say so that you weren't you're not a good guy like everyone thought you were. So I really wanted to make sure the female characters had a chance to say what they wanted to.
Yeah. That's awesome. And also because Anna is of Korean American descent, how was that like something that you wove into this Russian story? Yeah.
That was definitely, I mean, when I came up with the idea in 2012, I definitely already knew I wanted to make her, Korean or half Korean. I mean, in the book, she's half Korean because it was like her father, who was Korean, basically was marrying into like Manhattan society by marrying the mother, which kind of gave them entree into this very rarefied world. Because it's about, societal like concerns and like, so I wanted to put that in. The reason why I did that was probably more personal in the sense that my brother is married to a blonde, as I say. And so I have three nieces and nephews. And this was maybe before I even wrote my middle grade book. So this was at least 7 or 8 years ago. He was like, I really want you to write characters that are half Asian and, so that my kids see themselves reflected in a, in a book. And in my middle grade books, it was like, wasn't necessarily the main character, but with Anna Kay, I definitely was like, she needs to be front and center. Like that is like the movement that's happening now. It's like a lot of times, sometimes the person of color is like the sidekick and the best friend. And you see that in TV as well. But, it's everyone's a star in their own life. So she is the star of this story. So that was part of the impetus of me doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love it. So we have a question from a viewer. When is the right time to publish for someone with a collection of short stories who's interested in publishing for the first time? Any advice about that?
When is the right time? I honestly think any time that you can get something sold is basically the right time. I mean, I do think when you think about the real process is like, when is the right time to submit your manuscript? You have to think about it. You have to get an agent first, but you really need to put your best foot forward. I know when you write something new and you like love it and you're excited, I really would suggest you need to give it to as many different readers and people to make sure it's as polished as possible. Because in my 20s, I worked for a literary agent, and one of my jobs as an assistant was I read the slush pile, which is like, I mean, at that point in time, people didn't email in manuscripts. They literally mailed like a manuscript. So there was just stacks and stacks of manuscripts behind me that was very daunting. But honestly, my boss was like, you can read the first 30, 50 pages. And if it doesn't grab you, move on, basically. I felt guilty because I wanted to be a writer. So I usually did try to read a lot more because I was like, someone actually took the time and put so much time and effort into this. So I was definitely like staying up late and trying to read, as much of a book as possible. But I think you have to think about like, not that you only have one chance, but like you really need to make sure like your beginning is particularly strong. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So when you're starting a new like individual project, how do things, I mean, you've told us kind of the impetus of Anna Karenina, but like other projects, how do new ideas come to you? Is it like a premise or characters, or does it depend?
It really varies. With my middle grade books, I was working on the Disney Channel show at the time, and how it works is that when Disney, they do a lot of focus groups and marketing, and they were like, we want a talking dog show. Like they already knew that would test well with kids. So this was before Dog with a Blog came out. So that show was actually in development. But in Hollywood, there's a lot of multiple projects that are like never see the light of day, where they're like, oh, if this one doesn't work out, they put out a writing assignment where they're like, we're looking for other ideas about talking dog shows, basically. And I'm obsessed with dogs. So I was like, oh my God, I want to do this. So I actually came up with an idea that I pitched, which ended up becoming Elvis and the Underdogs. But I pitched it, and it was about a kid who was like not fully special needs, but he was always the sickly kid. He was a little bit of the underdog, was sick all the time, and he had and then he had his first seizure. And then there are therapy dogs that actually can detect seizures, which I found fascinating. I honestly think I read an article about a boy and his dog in People magazine before I had come up with this idea. I was like, oh, which I found amazing that a dog could even detect something before it, could happen. And so I was like, oh, that's what happens in this book. And then, but the dog that he receives, because these dogs get specialized training, he got the wrong dog, because this dog was trained to be, the president of the United States dog. And so actually he was able to talk. And I kind of left it a mystery about whether the dog and the boy were actually talking, or whether, because he seemed like he was the only one who could hear the dog. So I pitched the whole show. I was super excited to Disney, and they were like, no, thank you. We don't actually do shows about children with like disabilities. We do aspirational, good looking, like children who can sing and dance. That was granted, like, 8, 9 years ago at the time. They've definitely since changed their movement. But at that time, that was what I was told. And then I was so sad because I had this whole idea and character and story in my head. So that is the thing about TV, is that if you have a script and then nothing ever happens with it, it just goes away. It doesn't get seen. I mean, it doesn't turn into anything. And I had never written a children's book before, but I was like, oh, I'd really like to try. So I started getting up early, like 2 hours before work in the mornings. And I was like, I'm just going to try to write 10 pages a day of this story, which I had figured out already, and just see what happens. And so that's what I did. And then I think it was 4 months later, I finished my first middle grade, and I was able to sell it. So was great.
Wow, 10 pages a day is a lot.
I know. That was my goal. I didn't necessarily do it. I'm a very fast, now I've heard the term, it's called drafting. I didn't even know. I'm a very fast drafter. Like with Anna Kay, when I wrote it, my first draft was 529 pages, which is huge. So I sold it at 465. So I greatly reduced it, but I always go forward. If I have to go backwards and think about it, I'll just talk myself out of it. So that is always, I just do a really dirty, fast, messy first draft. That's just basically a nightmare, and then I kind of pick through, but I want to get it out on the page because it's so much easier to handle at that point in time. So for me, that's just one thing that's been good. I've always been able to write quickly. So
yeah. So then what does revision look like for you?
Very, very messy. I am very fortunate because my husband is the son of 2 English teachers. So he is an incredible editor and his grammar skills are incredible and mine are lacking a little bit, I feel like. So, for me, it's just basically going back to the very beginning and cutting. And once you read it and you have a little bit of space, you're like, oh, this doesn't work, etc. With Anna Kay, in the beginning, I kind of was writing it a little bit like it was a classic, sort of. I wasn't sure of the tone. So it sounded very formal and it was an omniscient narrator. But I was like, oh, it's sort of too stiff and I didn't really like it. So, but again, I didn't go back and correct it. I just kept going forward. So most of the work for Anna Kay really was matching the tone because I kind of hit my stride in the middle of it. And I was like, oh, this is what these characters sound like. This is what the book is. So I had to go back and course correct and rewrite the beginning a bunch of times. So.
But because I feel like so often it's easy to get stuck in the middle or stuck in the beginning where you just write the first, 10,000 words or whatever, just over and over and over. And sometimes there's a benefit to just keep plowing through and knowing that you'll find things along the way.
Yeah, totally. You'll be surprised at what you discover at the end and you'll be like, oh, that sort of works. And you'll just I don't know, the characters just become more and more clear and become like people. And you're like, oh, well, I don't really think she would have done that, what I had her do in the beginning, because that doesn't sound like who she is, basically. So you can go back and that's the way I find a lot of my stories is I just keep writing. I've been writing the sequel to Anna Kay right now. And I have to say, because I don't have Anna Karenina as a plot to follow and it was all on me, it was a pretty daunting project. And I think I spent a lot of time just writing pages and pages that ultimately were getting cut because I was trying to find the story and that what I really wanted to tell. So it's definitely been a process. It's definitely been the first book for me.
Yeah. Do you know, and you said you deviated with Anna Kay. Did you know where you wanted it to end up or did you find that along the way?
I knew I was going to change the big dramatic ending for sure. So I knew that part and I wasn't totally, it's funny, in the book, there's a chapter where it ends at a prom thing. And then there's an epilogue that really goes further. And that I thought I finished it, at the end of the chapter. I didn't even do the epilogue, but it just felt a little, I was like, oh my gosh, I finished. It's amazing. And then the next day I was like, it just didn't feel finished. It just, I don't know. So I actually went back in and then wrote the epilogue then. It was just a sense though that I had. And then I was like, oh, now I'm done. Now it's at a good place. So I completed all the stories and, in a way that sort of satisfied me.
So with this new one, did you do any outlining or you're just start at the beginning and see how it goes?
I should have outlined everyone. Just let you know, I know I've learned all these terms from being on Instagram and a bookstagram, because I've just heard all these terms now about being a pantser, which is fly by the seat of your pants, or an outliner. And I have always been a pantser. But in TV, you definitely have to outline. That's just one of the stages for any feature or for TV show. You have to outline. So I do both. And why I didn't outline, I should have, honestly, because the sequel was really tricky for me. I had an idea and I was like, oh, I know it. I know these characters. I don't need an outline because I didn't outline technically the first one. I just was able to put it through, I figured it out in my head as I was going. And that did not happen this time. I definitely, so now I wish, now it's too late into the process, but my husband definitely got a good old, I told you so. Because he was like, you should outline this. And I was like, nah, I think I got it,
Fine.
Yeah.
Do you think in the kind of TV speak, like A plot, B plot, like 5-act structure, does that translate into your prose writing too, or is it just two very separate things?
It's pretty separate. I feel like I do think about like, an A plot and a B plot, like the main story. And it's funny because in the sequel, I mean, I don't know if I'm sharing too much, but who cares at this point in time. I definitely knew that it followed 3 different love stories in the first one. So I was like, oh, I want to like do a new big love story as well. But it wasn't Anna, it was a different character. And then when I was reading it recently, I was like, ooh, the Anna story isn't quite as like, and she's, the titular character. So, I mean, so I knew I needed to hers a little bit. It's just funny, like, because I was like, oh, I'm attracted to like the new first love story. That's the one that's like so exciting and new. So I was like, oh, I need to now really think about like what I can give for Anna. So I had to like, that's where I had to like do a little bit of changes. So, because like in TV, when you think about it, like we have a certain number of characters and you have to service all the actors, right? I mean, it's just like, it's a very clear decision where you're like, oh, so-and-so doesn't have anything to do and they're getting paid for this week. So they need stories too. So you really, it's a different sort of thinking. So, you had to think about it that way.
Yeah. So we just have a few more minutes, sadly, because I've loved talking to you. But so I have 2 more questions for you. So what advice would you give to young writers, and particularly to young Asian American writers?
What advice? One, if your parents say that you have to be a lawyer, you don't have to listen to them. You don't have to be a lawyer. You're allowed to choose what you want to do. The other advice for Asian Americans, I would say, my older sister gave to me is like, if you get really good grades, your parents will just like not pay attention. You'll please them in one area, then you can kind of do your own thing, which really worked for me because I always was like, had good grades and then they were happy. I mean, they only start digging into my room and being like, what are you up to? When your grades start slipping. So that's one piece of advice. In terms of writing, I think a lot of people tend to get stuck in a genre, right? Like I definitely went through a Stephen King phase, but I wasn't only reading horror. And then I know people are like, oh, I only just love romance, or I only love chick lit or like rom-coms. But I really think like I have to be curious and to read so many different genres really helps because it just like opens your mind of all the different writing styles that are out there and kind of, and it's just, I'm amazed by how many different voices and different styles that you can do, because it's hard when you read a book and you love it and you're like, oh, but I could never write something like this, but you don't know, but maybe you could write a different type of book. I mean, it's just like, so I think reading a lot of variety, like I read mysteries, I read thrillers, I read, I honestly hadn't read that much young adult before I sort of wrote a young adult because, I'm no longer a young adult, but I mean, I would read all the books that I heard about, like The Fault of Our Stars. I heard about it because it like the ones that like The Hunger Games, the ones that crossed over and became mass appeal. But now, I mean, I've been reading a lot of, young adult, and I just wish I had such books when I was younger. I mean, it's amazing, like the topics and, what they get into, because we just didn't have access to that.
Yeah, same. Which leads perfectly into my last question, which is, what books are you pumped about right now?
What's my pumped? It's funny, when I'm writing a book, I don't have that much time to read. So I don't really tend to read as much, but I have a big growing stack. I read The Ninth House. I'd never read fantasy that much before. And I read The Ninth House over the last Christmas break. And then I read the Shadow and Bone series after that. So I've been kind of dabbling a little bit more into like, I bought a couple fantasies books of different authors that usually when I'm on a panel with someone, I tend to like buy their books because I want to see what they're up to. I have the sequel to American Royals, Majesty. I had met Catherine McGee and she gave me a blurb on my book. So I was very excited to read that. So, I mean, and I also have Charlie Kaufman's new book. He's the screenwriter and director, because I was like always been fascinated about his wacky brain. And I was like, oh my God, I love first novels. Like they're always so encouraging to me, because you're like, oh, I want to see someone's first attempt, and honestly, I mean, a goal of mine is still to write an adult novel. So, I mean, that's still like on the thing. So I love reading new writers. So that's always fun, like a big debut.
Yeah, awesome. Love it. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been Such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. I had a great time. It's anytime.
Excellent. And for those watching, join us next week at the same time, 4 o'clock on Wednesday. Next week, we will be chatting with Adi Al-Said, author of Let's Get Lost and a couple of other books. So until then, stay safe and keep reading.
Bye.
Bye.